Go. So good morning. So let's begin with the Parsha this week. The Parsha this week is a double Parsha, Vayakel Pekudei. And it is these two Parshas are the final Parshas of the book of Exodus. So at the end of this week, we will be 2/5 of the way through the Torah. So we are getting there towards the end of the Torah. Well, sort of. We're almost halfway through. Almost Passover. And so let me begin with the just telling a little bit about the Parsha. The Vayakel means he gathered. Moses comes down the mountain. He gathers all the people, and first he commands them to observe the Shabbos. And then he tells them to build the Mishkan. He says that everyone should donate towards the dwelling, towards building the Mishkan. Everyone should donate whatever they can. And there's a list of what exactly they need, what they would like people to donate. And he gives that. Then he appoints Betzalel, who was his great-great-nephew, and Ahaliav from the tribe of Dan, who were together going to lead the building of the Mishkan. And then the Torah goes into great detail how the Mishkan was built, repeating almost word for word from the instructions that we had a few weeks ago. And now it gives us just the details of how it was built, building the walls of the Mishkan and the drapings of the Mishkan, the Ark of the Covenant and the menorah and the table for the bread and the golden altar for incense and the copper altar for sacrifices, and each item of the Mishkan was built. Then that's the first parsha, Vayakel. Then Pekudei begins with these are the numbers. Pekudei means numbers of what was donated, and it goes through a list of what was donated, how much gold, how much silver, how much copper was donated for the Mishkan, and then describes the making of the clothing of the Kohanim of the for the priests, and then it describes how they then brought all the various items to Moshe to get his approval, and then Moshe put them all together, erects the Mishkan, puts it all up, describes the detail, how he put up each item, and then Hashem tells him that the Mishkan is going to start its official service on the first of the month of Nisan, which was almost a year after the Exodus. And once they do put up the Mishkan, then the cloud comes down over the Mishkan, and that is a sign that Hashem's presence is in the Mishkan. And with that, we conclude the book of Exodus. So that is our parsha in short. This week, once again, for the fourth time in 5 weeks, we take out a second Torah during the month of Adar. We do that almost every week. And in this one, we read the Parsha of HaChodesh, which is the very first instructions Hashem gave Moshe while still in Egypt. It starts with telling us that this new moon that you see is going to be the beginning of the month, which our sages say Hashem taught Moshe the calendar, because you cannot have any dates without a calendar. So he taught him the rules of the Jewish calendar. And then he gave him instructions for the Passover sacrifice that they were to bring while they were in Egypt. They were to slaughter a lamb, and they were to take its blood and put on the lintel and on the doorposts, and eat the lamb that night, roasted in their homes, together with matzah and maror. And so this was their very first Seder. And so we have those instructions, and then we read those instructions now to get us ready for Passover, which is going to be in just over 2 weeks, just 2.5 weeks is going to be Passover, coming up very, very soon. It's going to be 2.5 weeks from Shabbat. It's going to be 3.5 weeks from today. And so while I mentioned Passover, I just want to mention a couple quick things. Firstly, we will be having a Seder here at the JCC. If you don't yet have plans, we'll have it both Seders. If you don't yet, the first Seder we do kind of a communal Seder. Second Seder is more of a family Seder. But if you don't have plans for the first or second Seder, please join us for the Seders. We want every Jew to come to the Seder. We have a charge that we charge just because it's very, very pricey Passover food. If the charge is an issue, do not worry. Just come, let me know. I'd be happy. We don't want any Jew to miss out on the Seder. So that's firstly. Then Also, it is one should eat shmura matzah at the Seder. Shmura matzah is handmade matzah that was made for the sake of the mitzvah and guarded. The matzah was guarded that it should not become chametz. Most of the matzah they sell in the stores is not shmura matzah, not ideal to be eaten at the Seder. Costco does sell shmura matzah. We also sell it here. I'll tell you a secret: if you could still get it at Costco, it's a little cheaper, but a lot cheaper. But we're selling them here, and if you'd like shmura matzah, you're welcome to buy from us. We also, the Rebbe encouraged us to ensure that every Jew have at least one matzah for each Seder. So we give out these boxes with 2 matzahs in them, one for each Seder, and we try to give them out to the whole community. I will have them in the coming weeks to give out to anyone here who wants. But we, previous years, since we cannot give out thousands on our own, we've asked for volunteers from the community to distribute matzah to their Jewish neighbors. We'll give you a list of all your Jewish neighbors, and usually we do about 20 per person, and then you can go around and deliver just up and down your block. And so anyone who would like to do that, I know some of you have done it previous years, if you would like to do that, we'd greatly, greatly appreciate it. Please let me know after the class if you can. Any questions? Well, we didn't really talk much about Passover, but about the Parsha or about Passover, and then I will get to today's topic. Yes, Barry?
Yeah, I noticed when I took my list previous years, sometimes I go to a house and there'll be 4 apartments, and there's no place that mentioned where that.
Very good question. Sometimes the list is not entirely accurate because we give you our kind of very large list. If you have additional information for us, please let us know and we will update it. Yes, please. Please, we would be glad to update it so that we don't have that problem again. Yes, definitely. Any other questions? Yes, Annie.
Do both Costco's in Torrance and Hawthorne have the shmura matzah?
That is a very good question. I don't know about the Costco in Torrance. I have never been there. I know the Costco on Washington always has shmura matzah and a nice selection of kosher meat and kosher cheeses. I have never seen the shmura matzah here in Hawthorne, except for this year. I saw it for the first time, and they do have it now. So I don't know if they have it today. I did see it maybe 2 weeks ago. They run out pretty quickly because they're by far the cheapest. But you might be able to find it still there. Any other questions? All right, well then let's get straight to our topic for today. And today we're going to address the question of finding the 10 lost tribes. Before we start, I just want to be clear, what we're not going to talk about is, we're not going to talk about what actually happened to the 10 lost tribes. We did a class about that. Now about 7-8 years ago, but it is on the podcast, and I did send a link in the email I sent on Friday because I knew everybody would want access to it, and we'll post a link on the podcast that I post from this class. We're not going to talk about what actually happened to them. We're going to talk about finding the 10 lost tribes. So after the death of King Solomon, and this is going back almost 3,000 years, the kingdom of Israel was split in 2. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel, which became known as the kingdom of Israel, while 2 southern tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, formed their own kingdom, led by members of the house of David, by Solomon's son Rehoboam, and that became known as the kingdom of Judah. So now, instead of there being a single united kingdom, there were 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom of 10 tribes called the kingdom of Israel, a southern kingdom of 2 tribes called the kingdom of Judah. The 2 kingdoms lasted for over 200 years, until the northern kingdom was invaded by the Assyrians. The Assyrians had built an empire covering much of the Middle East. They invaded the northern kingdom and captured it, and then they exiled all the people from the country. This was a general Assyrian policy as they built their empire. In those days, they didn't have an easy way to communicate, to keep enough soldiers in enough places to stop people from rebelling. The way they kept nations from rebelling was by moving everyone they conquered. They moved them around within their empire so that they would assimilate everyone into an Aramaic-speaking Assyrian culture. And they essentially did. They destroyed all these small tribes that had existed previously in the ancient Middle East, and everyone became Aramaic-speaking Assyrians in that region. So they exiled the 10 tribes, and they bring in their place a group of non-Jews from Mesopotamia that become known as Kutim, because one of the places they came from was a town called Kut. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom remains, although the Assyrians did try to capture the southern kingdom. Their armies fell at the gates of Jerusalem in a amazing story that we've done a class before, dedicated to the fall of the Assyrian at the gates of Jerusalem. But as a result, they failed to capture the southern kingdom, and they did not exile them. The southern kingdom lasted for close to 200 years after that, and it was eventually conquered by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians then, who had a similar policy to the Assyrians, they were really kind of a continuation of the Assyrians, and the Babylonians then exiled all of the Jews from Judea, from the southern kingdom. It was now much larger. It had become kind of covered much of the land of Israel. They exiled all the Jews primarily to Babylon. It was only later that Jews were allowed to go back and build the second temple. Jews today are largely descendants of the people from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin that were exiled to Babylon. In fact, one of the reasons why we are called Jews, Yehudim, is from the name Yehuda, from Judea, which was the kingdom, the surviving kingdom that we came from. So the question then is, what happened to the other 10 tribes? Now, there are many possible answers to that question. It is possible that they are gone forever. It is possible that they eventually merged with the other Jews. It is possible that they were hiding somewhere. We don't know for certain what happened to them. We previously did a class on what happened to them, which I've posted already, and I will post below on this podcast a link to that other class about what actually happened to them, and that is a fascinating question. What do we believe as Jews? What do we believe happened to them? Regardless of what actually happened to them, without getting into where they really are and what really happened to them, certainly many Jews and non-Jews throughout history believe that they were hiding somewhere, that there were tribes that knew they were Jewish, had not assimilated, were actively Jewish, even observant, although when they had been exiled, they had been exiled because of their idol worship, but they were now actively Jewish, even righteous, according to many, and they are there somewhere, and it's just a matter of finding them. So today, I don't want to talk about where they are or where they could be, but what I'd like to focus on is the history of that search for the lost tribes and the tales of sightings of the lost tribes. So to start with, we have many early midrashim. The midrashim mostly come from what's called the classical period, the Roman period, the era of the Mishnah and the Talmud. We have many midrashim that describe the 10 tribes. We also have some books of apocrypha. Apocrypha are the Tanakh, our Hebrew scriptures, have 24 books, the 5 books of the Torah, plus 19 additional books. We have a number of books from that era, in other words, from either the biblical era itself or the early Greek era right after the biblical era, that did not, for various reasons, make it into Tanakh, whether because they were written later or because the authors of Tanakh decided to, the ones who canonized, who finalized which books go into Tanakh, which we believe were the men of the Great Assembly, chose to leave a number of books out. Those books that were left out were included by Catholics and many other Christians in their Bible, and they are known as Apocrypha. And some of the Apocrypha describe stories of the 10 tribes, or stories from the 10 tribes. So there are definitely these early accounts certainly written by Jews, of the 10 tribes. But moving on in our history, they kind of go, well, there are stories about them, of people connecting with them again in these early times, not long after they were originally exiled, whether in the late First Temple period or the right after the destruction or the early Second Temple period. And we had traditions as to what happened to them recorded in Midrashim. The first time that we actually get to meet someone from the 12 tribes is in the 9th century or in the late 800s. At this point, much of the Middle East and North Africa was under Arabic control. This is the period known as the Gaonim, which we've done a class on, a period when Judaism was centered in Babylon or modern-day Iraq, where there were two great yeshivot, two great schools, and their leaders were essentially the spiritual leaders of Jews around the world, and people would send them questions. So we have a question that was recorded, and we still have the record of it, copies of it, where there was a fellow in the there's a fellow that showed up in the city of Kirwan. Kirwan was a city in Tunisia. It was a major Arabic center, trade center. It was one of the largest cities in the Arab world. It has since been entirely destroyed. It lasted for maybe 200 years. In the 800s, 900s, was destroyed. We spoke about it a little bit when we did our class on Tunisian Jews. But Kirwan was a very, very big Arabic city, metropolitan, and it had a very large Jewish community. So there was a fellow who shows up in Kirwan, and he says his name is Eldad from the tribe of Dan. Eldad Hadani. Now, Dan would be one of the 10 tribes that had disappeared. And he claimed he had a long story, many trials and tribulations, till he made it from his country to the land to Kirwan. He claimed to be from the tribe of Dan, and he claimed that Dan had an independent kingdom in Ethiopia. And so did a number of other tribes. He describes having been with the tribes of Yisachar, and he describes what some of the other tribes are. And he claims that their tribe, he speaks Hebrew, he does speak Hebrew, and he claims that their tribe has the Torah in its original Hebrew, has some of the books of the scriptures, not all of them, because remember, some of the books of the scriptures, like the story of Esther, were written after the destruction of the temple, long after the tribes were gone. And they do not have the Talmud. They do have the oral traditions, but they don't have the Talmud. And they didn't know about any of the Talmudic scholars who all lived post-Second Temple period, much, much later in history. And he shares various traditions. He actually wrote a book of his short book pamphlet. It's been translated, you get in English, of his trials and his travels. He was arrested. He was caught by cannibals, all sorts of kind of very fanciful story. And he also shares some of the laws that he shares some of the laws, including some laws, like he shares some of the laws of slaughter, of ritual slaughter, Jewish ritual slaughter, that are different from the laws that we have, from our traditional Jewish laws. So the community in Kirwan was not sure what to make of this guy. Should they take him seriously? Should they not take him seriously? Is he legitimate? Is he not legitimate? So they did what any good Jewish community would do at the time. They sent a letter to the Gaon, Rav Tzemach Gaon, the leader of the academy in Babylon, to get his take on it. Rav Tzemach Gaon himself responds that yes, it sounds like a legitimate story. We know that there are 10 lost tribes, very likely that they have a kingdom, and it makes sense that they only have the oral tradition, but not the Talmud, and not all the teachings of the Talmud that came later after they left. They don't have all the later books of scripture. All that makes sense, very possible. But he said, don't assume that you can trust all his details. Even if the story is true, it could be he got some of his details confused. And so don't worry about the the changes in Jewish law that he has. So he certainly was open to the idea and accepted it, essentially, at least in theory, that there is this Jewish community in Ethiopia, these Jewish tribes that control these kingdoms, these Jewish kingdoms in Ethiopia that are from these 10 lost tribes. Yes?
So when the lost tribes were exiled, was that after the destruction?
No, before the destruction of the first temple. The lost tribes are exiled some 2,600 years ago. Go way back.
Because I'm just curious why the laws of sacrifice would be different. I mean,
the laws of ritual slaughter, shechita, slaughter for meat. Well, they claimed that they had a different tradition. We got it wrong,
okay.
Right? That's what he claimed. Again, not clear that we should take him at his word.
Well, it could have changed, right?
The laws can never change. We don't believe the laws, the
That's
traditions
my question.
can change. No. But there can be, a rupture in tradition. There could be tradition can go in two different directions. In theory, whether that actually happened or not is discussion for itself. How we preserve the oral tradition. But anyway, this was a kind of story, and the question was how serious to take it. And the answer was you could take him seriously. It sounds good, but it sounds legitimate. But don't take all the details seriously. He might be a little off in some of the details. Interestingly, this story seems to have been pretty famous. About 100 years later, there was a great Jewish statesman, Rav Chasdai ibn Shaprut, who was perhaps deserves his own class, who was a great Jewish statesman in Spain, a Jewish leader and a treasurer to the Spanish king. Again, this is Muslim Spain, right? Islamic Spain. And he had heard a story about how there was a Jewish kingdom called Khuzaria in what today would be southern Ukraine. And he was fascinated by it, and he sent a letter to Joseph, the king of the Khuzars, to ask him about the Khuzars and where they came from. And in his letter, and we once did a class where we spoke about the Khuzars and where they came from and what happened to them. There was a real Jewish kingdom around that period that lasted for maybe 200 years in southern Ukraine of non-Jews that had converted to Judaism. But Rav Chasdai doesn't know that. He's very far away in Spain. He just heard this rumor. He sends a messenger with a letter. And in the letter, and we have copies of the letter, in the letter he writes that perhaps you Khuzars are descendants of the 10 lost tribes. And he says 100 years ago, there was a member from the 10 lost tribes from Ethiopia that showed up in Eldad Hadani, that showed up in Kirwan. Maybe you know of him. Maybe you're connected to the other tribes. Turns out Joseph sent him a long letter back. They have a whole exchange of letters, which we still have today. And the King Joseph says, no, we're not connected. We are Jewish, and we observe all the Torah, but we are not connected to the 10 lost tribes. We are, our ancestors converted to Judaism many years ago. So anyway, so that's the first person we know who came from the 10 lost tribes. After that, for the next 500 years, or 600 years, we don't have really any direct records, at least, of direct encounters with members of the 10 tribes. I'll tell you about one in a moment. It doesn't mean that Jews forgot about them. Jews didn't forget about them. There was still plenty of people, both Jews and non-Jews, Christians, that were searching for the 10 lost tribes, that were fascinated by the 10 lost tribes. The concept of the 10 lost tribes wasn't even limited to the Jewish tribes. In fact, there was, in the Middle Ages, during the Crusader period, when there were wars between Christians and Muslims, and the Christians were struggling to keep their Crusader possessions in the Middle East, there was this Christian claim that there was a great Christian king called Prester John who lived in India and was the king of a mighty Christian nation, and he would help save them. Now, often along with that claim about Prester John, came another claim that there was another kingdom of red Jews. They were called in German Reute Juden. So these were red Jews that were this mighty kingdom that would attack Christian Europe. In fact, some of the times Jews were persecuted because because they were afraid of the red Jews were coming. So they wanted to harm the Jews in their own areas, and before the red Jews got there. The Jews also, of course, heard about these red Jews, and although it's not clear that anyone claimed to have met any of them, but they were hoping that the red Jews would come and save them from the persecution. We also have a similar kind of tale that was out there. We have traditions going back already to the Talmudic period, already mentioned by Yonatan ben Uziel, one of the early sages of the Mishnah, of the Tanaic period, of the Mishnaic period, that there's a tribe known as Bnei Moshe, descendants of Moshe, descendants of Moses, that are mighty warriors and will one day come and save Jews who are in trouble. So there were definitely stories about these people. There was a Jewish traveler, kind of like Marco Polo, but his name was Benjamin of Tudela, Binyamin Tudela, Tudela was a town in Spain. He was a Spanish Jew who traveled across much of the ancient world in the 12th century. In fact, much of what we know about Jewish life in the ancient world comes from him, because he visited hundreds of communities over a number of years of travel. And he both describes the communities that he visits, as well as he describes things that he hears from them. When he is in Persia, he hears that to the east of Persia, there are these great kingdoms where the 10 lost tribes are. He doesn't actually make it there to visit them, but he does hear about them. Now, fast forward a little bit. In the 17th century, it's in the 1600s, there was a book printed called Maaseh Akdamus, the story of Akdamus, that was printed in the 17th century, but it told the story of an event that happened around the year 1401. So going back. Now, Akdamus, what is Akdamus? Akdamus is a beautiful poem that Jewish communities, Ashkenazi Jewish communities, have accustomed to read on Shavuot. Before we read the Torah, on Shavuot, we have this beautiful poem about the Torah that we read. So this is the story of the Akdamus poem. And it tells a story that there was a Christian monk that greatly threatened the Jews in Germany. And he challenged them he also knew magic, and he challenged them to a debate and a magical contest in front of the emperor. And the Jews did not know what to do. They were afraid they would not be able to counter the monk successfully. And so one of the Jewish leaders has a dream where he's told that there's no Jew in Germany that could help them. But if they go to the east, and they can find a Jew from the 10 lost tribes that will be able to help them. So they find they have the Chazan, the cantor, whose name is Rebbe Meir Chazan, Rebbe Meir the cantor, and he is sent to go. And after a very, very, very long journey, he arrives at a river called the Sambation. The Sambation River, the Midrashim tell us that the 10 tribes live over a river called the Sambation that cannot be crossed because it's either it throws stones or its waters are so rough it can never be crossed. The waters only calm down on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, the waters are calm. But Jews cannot cross the river on Shabbos because it is forbidden to cross on Shabbos. So, however, over here he reaches the Sambation. It's impossible to cross until Shabbos. And then he normally would not cross the river because it is Shabbos. But now the Jews of Germany are in danger. In order to save lives, you are allowed to violate the Shabbos. And so he crosses on Shabbos in violation. Over there, he manages, after a long story, he manages to meet the members of these tribes, and where they have this great kingdom, and he tells them about the predicament of the Jews of Germany, and they send this small Jew with a limp to go back to Germany to debate the monk. However, the rabbis over there of the 10 tribes tell him that he is unable to go back to Germany himself, because he was only able to cross the Sambatyon and violate the Shabbos to save the Jews of Germany. But once he crossed already, he has no permission to go back. But their representative is able to violate the Shabbos to go back. But once he goes back to Germany, he would never be able to cross again back to the Jews of the 10 tribes. And so before parting, this Jew does go back and he saves the Jews of Germany. But before parting, Rabbi Meir writes the Akdamas poem and tells it to bring it back to his community in Germany. And that is the story of where this poem came from. So this is a story, again, of a Jew who apparently, we don't know exactly where, somehow met the Jews of the 10 lost tribes, and a member of the 10 lost tribes around the year 1400, a member of the 10 lost tribes came back to Germany and saved the Jews of Germany by debating this monk in front of the emperor. We don't have any other historical records of this story, but that's the story that was published. That's the story that was told. Any questions? Yes.
So when, I'm going way back to something you talked about before, when that man comes from, what he said.
Eldad Hadani?
Yeah. Did anybody go back to see if there's more of them?
No. Travel then, remember, was very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. No, they didn't go back to see if there's more of them. We don't know much about them. So fast forward now to the 16th century. This is the early 1500s. It is a rough time for Jews because Jews had just been expelled from Spain and Portugal and Sicily and France and much of Western Europe. It is a rough time for Christians because in Europe, at least in their view, because the Ottomans are this Turkish group that have conquered Constantinople a couple decades earlier, destroyed the remnants of what had been the Roman Empire, what today we like to call Byzantine, and were marching across Europe. Eventually, they'll be stopped at Vienna, but they're marching deep into Europe and on the march and growing, and they're threatening Christendom. So there is a fellow who shows up in Italy, and he says his name is David Haruveni. David from the tribe of Reuven. And he says that the tribe of Reuven have this large kingdom, are mighty warriors. They have this big kingdom in India and far to the east. And they, however, are feeling threatened by the growing Ottoman Empire. Remember, that Ottoman Empire was marching into Europe, but at the same time, they had also conquered Iraq, and they were marching eastward as well, right? It was this large empire that was growing. And so he went to the Pope, and he tells the Pope that he proposes an alliance, that he was sent by his brother, Joseph, the king of the Reubenites, to propose an alliance between the Jewish tribes of India and the Christian countries of Europe, and together they will defeat the Ottomans, the Christians from the west, and the Jews from the east, the 10 tribes from the east. And so, surprisingly, they took him very seriously. The Pope takes him very seriously. Their Portuguese ambassador in Rome is very impressed by him and recommends that he go visit Portugal. And maybe the king of Portugal would be interested in joining this alliance. Now remember, Portugal, this is in the early 1500s. Portugal, a couple decades earlier, had just expelled all their Jews or forced many Jews to convert to Christianity. There's many conversos now in Portugal. There's no Jews living in Portugal. This is a man who is wearing Eastern clothing, Oriental clothing, and seems to speak Arabic, and claims that he's Jewish. And he's invited by the king to Portugal. So he goes to Portugal. The king of Portugal is very, very impressed by him and offers to send a whole armada with him put troops at his disposal to help him defeat the Ottomans, if he could get more leaders in Europe involved. Particularly, they were focused on Charles V. Charles V at the time, in the early 1500s, was the monarch of much of Europe. He controlled what was then the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, and Spain, and the Netherlands, and a bunch of other places as well. So if you could get him involved, he was the most powerful monarch by far in Europe at the time. He would be a good guy to then they'd be able to put together an army to defeat the Ottomans. While he's in Lisbon, publicly David Haroveni, publicly Jewish in Lisbon, where Jews are not allowed to live, there are many conversos that had converted to Judaism 3 decades earlier. And many of these conversos are now see this Jew who is, flying. He's traveling with a whole entourage now, and he's flying a Jewish flag that he had, and as an ambassador from a great Jewish kingdom, and they're all very excited. And so many of these conversos return to Judaism. And the Portuguese at the time don't seem to do anything about it. They don't mind, because they're excited about the prospects of this alliance, including one minister in the king's court, a converso by the name of Diego Pires, who circumcises himself and gives himself a Jewish name, Shlomo Molcho. Now, Shlomo Molcho himself is a fascinating story for another time. Perhaps we could do a class one day on Shlomo Molcho. David Haroveni, he travels around Europe, working on this cause of building this alliance between the Christians in the West and the Jews of India in the East. And he eventually makes it, along with his student Shlomo Molcho, to Regensburg in Germany, where they meet Charles V, the great monarch of Europe. Now, at that time in Regensburg, knowing that they were coming, was another very famous Jew by the name of Yossel of Rosheim. Yossel Rosheim is another fascinating story. We once did a class on Jewish lobbyists, or Stadlonim in Yiddish, the old Jewish business of lobbying local governments to treat their Jews better. Rabbi Yossel of Rosheim was probably the greatest, or one of the greatest Jewish lobbyists of all time, and a fascinating story. He had a close relationship with Charles V and his, I think it was his grandfather Maximilian, and with Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheranism and Reformation. And so fascinating figure. But he was there at the time in the court of Charles V. And he is very afraid of David Haroveni because he doesn't believe him. And he's really afraid that if David Haroveni's shenanigans, if they fail and he turns out to be an imposter, they're going to let it out on all the Jews of Europe. All the Jews of Germany are going to get themselves into big trouble. And so he decides to put a stop to it early on. He tells Charles V, this man is a fraud. Don't believe a word he says. And Charles accepts, who's very close with Yossel of Rosheim, accepts his advice and has David Haroveni and Shlomo Molcho both arrested. And he turns them both over to the Inquisition. David Haroveni is sent back to Spain, which was part of Charles' reign, and eventually he is killed over there. So, but the quest to find these 10 tribes continues as we move through history, especially in the age of discovery. The late 15th century, 16th century was the age of discovery. The Americas are discovered. There are lots of explorers traveling all over, traveling through Africa, traveling through Asia, finding new islands, right? There's all this kind of age of discovery where all these new lands are being discovered and explorers are going. And so there's a lot of interest by both Jews and Christians in finding the 10 lost tribes. It's widely assumed by Jews and Christians at the time that the 10 tribes are somewhere out there. They just needed to be found. In fact, when Christopher Columbus set out on his expedition in 1492 to find the New World. He took a converso with him by the name of Louis de Torres, who spoke fluent Hebrew and fluent Aramaic, with the expectation that when they find Jewish lost tribes, they need someone who speaks Hebrew and Aramaic, the languages of ancient Jewish languages, to make sure that they can communicate. And so he was brought in order to communicate with the lost tribes when they find them. So it was an assumption back then that they would find lost tribes. They did end up discovering the Americas, and it turned out that most American natives, unfortunately, did not speak any Hebrew. Yet, many travelers, particularly in the New World, claim to have found Jewish native tribes in the New World. Many people believed that the American Indians or the American natives were the lost tribes. All of them, some of them, or they were somewhere out there. And as Reformation takes hold, that same 16th century in Germany, and there's all sorts of new groups splintering off, all sorts of new Protestant groups, Christian groups. Many of them are very messianic. In other words, they are anticipating and working towards what they believe in their Messiah. There was this kind of sense that as the end of times comes near, we need to find those missing tribes. For Christians, maybe it meant to convert them to Christianity. They would be kind of the Jews that the Jews in Europe refused to convert, but maybe they could find these tribes and convert them to Christianity. And this continues. This process continues throughout the 16th and into the 17th, throughout the 16th century. This especially rises to popularity with the rise of the Puritans in England in the 16th century, and particularly when Oliver Cromwell, himself a Puritan, deposes the king and takes over control of of England. And there's this real kind of strong messianic yearning in throughout England, and this sense that they need to find the lost tribes. And so many people report having found various tribes. But perhaps the most notable was there was a Jewish converso. That's a Jew, a Portuguese Jew who had converted, whose parents had converted to Judaism, by the name of Antonio de Montesinos. And this Jewish converso travels to Brazil. Antonio travels to Brazil, and over there in Brazil, he meets the American natives, and he discovers many of the American natives are being greatly mistreated. And many of them had been enslaved by the Portuguese and the Spanish. Many were made slaves. And he's very, very upset about the way the natives are being treated. And so he begins to befriend some of the natives. He becomes close friends with some of them. And he makes one native in particular who he's traveling with through South America. And they become very good friends, and he confesses to him that he is really a secret Jew. And this native tells him that we have lots of Jews here in South America, in the Amazon, deep in the Amazon. And he begs this native to introduce him to those Jews. And so he agrees, and after many days' journey, they arrive at a river, which they're forbidden to cross, but they see people on the other side of the river, that they're able to communicate with them, and they discover that these people are Jews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are from the tribe of Reuven. There are members of the tribe of Joseph that are nearby, and they observe the traditions, the Jewish teachings, and he wants to communicate. He wants to cross. He wants to go visit their area, but he's forbidden from doing so. He's told he's not allowed to share this with anyone, and so he has this amazing interaction with these Jewish tribes in South America. And so Antonio is very, very inspired by his experience. He comes back to Holland. Holland at the time, the Netherlands at the time, had just become independent from Spain, and the Holland had just become independent from Spain, and it was a haven. This is already the mid 1600s. It was a haven for Jews, for conversos. It was a place. One day I hope to do a class on the Jews of Holland. But it was a place where conversos from Spain and Portugal were able to go to and return to their Judaism. Most places in Europe, once your ancestors converted to Christianity, you were not allowed to convert back to Judaism. A Christian who converts to Judaism would, there was a death penalty in most of Europe. But Holland was a very tolerant society. It was a Protestant society that allowed Jews to return back to their faith. And so he goes to Holland, and over there he returns to Judaism. He takes on the name Aaron Halevi. Apparently he knew his grandparents were Levites. And over there he shares his story under oath with the famous Sephardic rabbi of Holland, Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael. Now, Menashe, who himself was a very, very fascinating fellow, very good friends with Rembrandt. In fact, Rembrandt drew a painting of Menashe, and friends with a lot of great Dutch thinkers at the time. He had long theorized, Menashe ben Israel had long believed that there were Jewish tribes in the Americas. And now he got confirmation for his belief of Jewish tribes in the Americas, and he wrote a book called Mikveh Yisrael, The Hope of Israel. And he tells Montesino's entire story in this book in great, great detail, and then he adds his own explanation, where he argues that the lost tribes have been found in the Americas. He notes that lost tribes have been found in India, in other places, and therefore it is a sign that Moshiach is almost here, that Moshiach is coming. Then he continues to argue in that book that before Moshiach comes, Jews must be scattered in the four corners of the earth. There's, however, one corner of the earth where Jews are not found. That is in England. England is in the corner of Europe. If you look at a map, it's in the corner. So England is a corner, and Jews are not found in England because they had been expelled almost 400 years earlier. They had been expelled from England in the late 1200s. So he argues the only thing that is delaying the coming of Moshiach is the readmitting Jews to England. His book, he originally writes it in both Spanish and Hebrew, but it's quickly translated into English and published in England. It gets the attention of Oliver Cromwell, who is at the time the leader of England, and he invited Menashe ben Israel to England to argue his case. And indeed, soon after, how influential Menashe ben Israel was in it or not, historians debate, but soon after that, Jews are indeed allowed back into England. This is all thanks to finding the lost tribes in the Amazon.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How did these mass amounts of people get to these different continents? Did they have ships that took passengers?
How did the tribes get there?
Yeah, whole community go from.
I don't know. There were various theories out there. There's still many theories today how the American natives got to America. I don't think historians are in agreement on that. At the time, there were many different theories out there on how people got to America in general. Remember, when they discovered the Americas and discovered people there, it really changed everything they knew about how civilization evolved and developed, because they had always knew that there were various groups within civilization that evolved in different places. But the Americas was never part of the story till they found it. Right, so the Europeans had theories, but they had to, move everything around, try to figure out where did these people come from. And so, yeah, it was a good question. There was a question how they got there, and there were various theories. Maybe I mean, they still have various theories, right? Maybe the Bering Strait was once possible, and you can walk across it. All sorts of different theories as to how it happened. We don't ultimately, I think, know.
Yeah, but wasn't that okay, I guess that was after the tribes got disbanded. The Bering Strait, because that's the theory that the Native Americans in North America came across the Bering Strait.
On the West Coast.
We don't know. There's lots of different theories, and I think historians disagree about it.
Yeah, but the East Coast, I mean, what do you do?
So Jews...
The theory is that they moved across.
Jews continue to search for the tribes, both Jews and Christians. Christians also were searching for the 10 tribes. Some found them in America. Some thought they could find them in the East, maybe in India, maybe in Africa. And there's been constant searches for the 10 lost tribes. And two that I will note is that for many generations, going back probably at least 500 years, there had been some but minimal contact between Jews in Egypt and Yemen with Jewish tribes in Ethiopia that claimed to be Jewish and descendants of Jewish lost tribes. Now remember, Eldad Hadani had claimed to originally be from Ethiopia. In the mid-19th century, European Jews had this renewed interest in Jewish tribes in Ethiopia. It was now not as remote. It was easier to travel there. It was more realistic to communicate with people in Ethiopia. Jews began to travel to Ethiopia. So did Christians. So did Christian missionaries who found this group of Jews that they thought might be from the 10 tribes. And they tried to convert them to Christianity. Some of them forcibly converting, some of them trying to convert them, some of them pretending to be Jewish and then turning out to be missionaries. There's a lot of that too. The Ethiopians themselves, many of them claim to be members of the 10 tribes. Their official tradition is that, and this is, I think, true for Ethiopian Christians as well, is that they are descendants of the queen of Sheba, or Sheba in English, who met King Solomon. And although when the story is told in the Book of Kings, there's no romantic relationship, just a meeting between them. But in their tradition, there was a romantic connection, and they had children together, and those children and the Ethiopians descend from those children. That's a tradition that was found both among the Christians and the Jewish Ethiopians. That were often referred to as Beta Israel, the house of Israel. And there's really some debate about the exact origin of the Ethiopian Jews, where they come from, what their Jewish connection is. But there were definitely Jews that went there, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, some Jews that went and started teaching them about Judaism, because their knowledge of Judaism was very, very limited. While they had the scriptures, Tanakh, in their local language, they didn't speak any Hebrew, and they didn't have most of the Jewish traditions. And so there was a move to try to get them to become more Jewish-like. Eventually, in the late 20th century, most of them were airlifted to Israel and brought to Israel. Most of them today live in Israel. Their exact history itself remains up for debate, it remains contentious, I should say. Exactly, are they members of the tribes? Are they descendants of Solomon? Are they descendants of Jews? Where did they come from? Is a very good question. Around the same time, in the 19th century, as the British began to develop India and the colony of India, many Jews, particularly from Iraq, moved to India to help develop the economy there, and were very, very influential in British colonization. And when they came there, they discovered these ancient Jewish communities, both in the northeast as well as in the northwest of India. And these communities had also only limited Jewish involvement. Their Jewish practice was fairly limited, although they did have some sense of Judaism, some Hebrew prayers and things like that. And they can claim to be descendants of Jews who have moved there generations ago, which is likely factual. Exactly which Jews they came from, did they come from tribes? Did they come from other Jews? Were they originally Yemenite Jews that moved there, or Jews from Iraq that moved there 1,000 years ago and then lost contact with much of the Jewish community? We don't know exactly where they came from, these groups. The groups in the ancient Jews in India, we're not sure exactly. There's another group in India today. Most of the Cochin Jews and the Bnei Israel in India, most of them did make it to Israel today. But there is another group of Jews in northeastern India near Bangladesh that claim to be Bnei Menashe, descendants of the tribe of Menashe. And there are some that hypothesize that they are indeed descendants of the ancient tribe of Menashe. They don't have much Jewish practice, but there's many who see various practices and connections to Judaism, and it's very hard to know. When we did our class on the lost tribes, tribes that are not actively Jewish and don't have a Judaism that we recognize, it's very hard to know unless you have some sort of written history or some sort of long history. It's very hard to know exactly where they came from and what their Jewish connection might be. But I think our class today was less about where the 10 tribes might actually be and more about the story of members of the 10 tribes showing up, like Eldad Hadani and David Haroveni, and the stories of people that met members of the 10 tribes, like the story of Agdamus and the story of Antonio di Montesino. So definitely fascinating story that had a very great impact on history, and no question that both Jews and non-Jews have been searching for the 10 tribes for many years. Maybe we found them, maybe we didn't. Hard to ever say for certain what actually happened to them. But a big part of the search for the 10 tribes has been the expectation that when we find the 10 tribes, it will allow us to then gather in the scattered of Israel, which is kibbutz galiot, as we call it, which is the one of the predictions of Moshiach, of the future Redeemer, that he will gather the scattered of Israel. And so we need to know where all the scattered of Israel are before he can gather them up. So the search for the 10 tribes has very much been in preparation for the coming of Moshiach. And people were searching not just out of fascination, or because they wanted to find their fellow Jews that they hadn't yet met, but people, both Jews and Christians, were searching for the 10 tribes in order to help usher in the future redemption, in order to help bring Moshiach. So while some of it might be, in hindsight, looking at it now in our day and age, we might find some of it very strange, some of these stories. We might find some of these stories maybe a little fanciful, but what I think it all, and I didn't